Hola, buenas.
Lo vamos a hacer.
¿Qué tal? Ana de Venezuela. Vamos a visualizar esta entrevista de los atributos de Dios, hecha a Miller, a Jesús, en el 2012. ¿Qué tal? ¿Me oyes?
Sí, perfecto. Hola, Iván. Gracias por esta invitación.
Gracias a ti. Entonces, fíjate, es una entrevista así donde pues dura bastante, entonces nosotros pues podemos ver 1 hora y pico y quizá comentamos algo al final y tú me paras si va muy rápido, si no sé qué, pues como el inglés es mucho más rápido que el español, pero en general pues eso, no vamos a parar mucho o nada, ¿vale?
Está bien, está perfecto.
Vale, entonces todo bien, se oye todo, en teoría estamos transmitiendo por el YouTube y bueno, lo voy a comprobar un momento, en el teléfono voy a abrir ya estoy rodeados de aparatos, vaya toalla. Entonces voy a abrir mi canal en el teléfono y voy a ver si estamos ahí en directo. Y se va a oír ahí se va a abrir mi canal en el teléfono. Fíjate, ¿ves? Ahora se oye ahí. Y voy a ver si se oye duplicado todo. Bueno, pues ahora cierro y estamos ahí, en el Dios Google. Bueno, pues vamos para eso. Cuando quieras te silencias y a ver si no nos perdemos. Y un ratito, entre primera parte dura 2 horas 29, muchísimo, así que vamos a intentar hacer 1 hora 10, por ahí.
Sí,
Y
está
luego ya.
bien, 1 hora, está perfecto, 1 hora 10.
Tú te tienes que ir, pues como está silenciada, pues tú te puedes mover o lo que quieras cuando te silencies. Y si yo oigo ruidos, pues te silencio yo y todo eso.
Pero, mira, ahorita son las 3, hasta las 5 no es tan tarde. Yo puedo estar completa porque no tengo ningún programa. Vino la
Vale,
señora. Lo que tú dispongas, Iván, eso
vale.
va a ser.
Vale, entonces sí, hasta más o menos hasta ese momento. Vale, bien, pues vamos a empezar ya. Y ya me dices, si se oye bien, no me dices nada y ya está. Bueno, ese oyen unos perros, así que ya.
Voy a apagar voy a silenciarme por el perro.
Que ya empezamos, ya, sí, silénciate. Y si no se oye, me lo dices. El vídeo. Ahora empiezan bajito.
So today we're here with AJ to talk about God's attributes and qualities.
Who are you with, Lily?
We're with AJ Miller.
Who are you with, Lily?
I'm with Jesus.
See, you still haven't dealt with the emotions, though.
You
want to start again?
Yeah, sure.
Se oye bien, ¿no? La voz ahí. Fíjate que empiezan así, pues, de risas pues a ella le da reparo decir que es Jesús. Pero vamos, solo te interrumpo para eso. Espero que se oiga bien.
All right. Okay. So today we're here with.
You don't have to say it.
Oh, thank God.
You got your words back. You say it, yeah, that's fine.
Oh, thank you.
Just stare on you.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Bueno, ahí Jesús le ha dicho, no tienes por qué decir Jesús. Y por eso le dice ahí, puedes decir AJ, está bien. Entonces estamos por aquí. Espero que se haya entendido, aunque va rápido el diálogo, claro, ahí.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's like very few people have dealt with the issues.
Ahí está hablando con el público. Dice esto.
Still, and it's interesting that the media keeps going back to that 2009 or whatever it was, 10 talk that I did saying, Jesus, deal with it. And yet nobody who's listening to me still has really dealt with it. Which is okay. Away, Lily.
Okay.
That little bit at the front is fine on there if you want. There you go.
All right, okay. So today we're here with A.G. Miller, and we're going to be talking about God's attributes and qualities. And my name is Lily Faber, and I'm the interview today.
It's good, Lily. What's your background, Lily?
I was a neuroscientist, and I'm currently not working.
You're currently not working? You're currently living nearby us as well, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah.
Growing vegetables.
Growing vegetables instead of being a neuroscientist.
That's right.
Interesting change. It's not the only thing you're doing though.
No, I'm quite busy at the moment.
Exactly.
Okay, anyway, did you want to say about the office?
Yes, what I would probably like to say firstly to the viewers is that we are actually now inviting any member of the public or any person who is connected with divine truth in any way.
Esto no está en la transcripción. Dice que está invitando a todas las personas del público o que estén conectadas a la verdad divina de cualquier manera
To interview us.
para que nos entrevisten.
They need to be respectful in the way that they interview, and they also
Necesitan ser respetuosos a la hora de entrevistar y todo eso.
need to be aware that there might be a group of questions that exceed the amount of questions I've personally asked.
Y también tienen que ser conscientes de que puede haber un conjunto de cuestiones, una cantidad de cuestiones que exceden la capacidad, creo que ha dicho, ahora me he despistado, la capacidad de poder responder.
That will be added to the interview.
Así que podrían añadirlas a la entrevista, podrían ser añadidas a la entrevista algunas preguntas.
We'd be happy to have different people interviewing us from the public.
O sea, como que está diciendo que ellos añadirían cosas también. Pero que eso, que están contentos de recibir gente para que les entreviste.
As long as they are content to actually have these interviews placed on YouTube.
En la medida en que también las personas quieran colocar eso que hagan, los trabajos que hagan de entrevistarles en YouTube, en el canal de ellos también.
And the reason why we're doing that is that some people will be asking more introductory type of material.
Y la razón es porque algunas personas estaban pidiendo materiales más introductorios.
That would best be answered through the interview process.
Que serían mejor, que como serían mejor dispuestos sería con el proceso de la entrevista para responderlos.
And then presented to the public in an introductory manner.
Y eso, presentarlos al público de manera introductoria.
So we feel that in the future there'll be all sorts of people wanting to do different interviews.
Y sentimos que en el futuro habrá todo tipo de gente queriendo hacer entrevistas.
Including people wanting to interview us about religious matters.
También gente sobre cuestiones religiosas.
Century life.
La vida del primer siglo.
Current life.
La vida actual.
And lots of different subjects, basic subjects that we've
muchas materias diferentes básicas.
Probably already covered in seminars.
Las básicas ya probablemente han sido cubiertas en los talleres.
As well. If people want to be involved in the interview process, that all they need to do is send an email, to.
Y para todo lo que ha dicho antes, pues hay que mandar un email ahí.
office@divinetruth.com, and then that process will be engaged. And they have to nominate the subject that they would like to interview me on, and also they need.
Y simplemente tendrían que que escribir pidiendo, o sea, nombrando a ver cuál sería la materia sobre la que le van a entrevistar y todo eso.
There to be a willingness to sign a waiver saying that the interview material will be placed in public domain.
Y ellos van a requerir que firmen, que estén dispuestos a firmar el permiso para colocar el material que ellos hagan, como hemos dicho antes, también en el canal de Miller y Merrick,
Free.
gratuitamente.
But aside from that, there's no other requirements.
Y aparte de ese, no hay más requisitos,
Aside from somebody being passionate about the subject that they're interviewing about.
salvo que estén apasionados sobre el tema de la entrevista.
So we feel that would be an interesting process in the future to
Así que eso sentimos que será un proceso interesante en el futuro.
engage interviews from all sorts of backgrounds.
Y eso, involucrarse en entrevistas con todo tipo de trasfondos y eso.
So that was the introductory for this, and that could probably be placed on a separate, just a separate basic file as well, Igor. Yeah.
Y ahora, eso era la introducción a esto y que también le gustaría tenerlo en un clip independiente, esta introducción sobre los temas de la entrevista. O sea, sobre el general, así, de logística, digamos.
We feel that the interview process is a very important process to help engage people in this process of...
Sienten que ese proceso de hacer entrevistas es como muy importante para esto de involucrar, ayudar a la gente a que se
asking questions,
involucre en preguntar cosas y todo eso.
and getting answers.
Y obtener respuestas.
And so it'd be fantastic if many different people from all sorts of walks of life would be willing to interview at some point.
Así que sería fantástico que gente de todo tipo de formas de vida, etcétera, y les entreviste en algún momento. Años después, pues sí que tenían bastantes entrevistas en el 2013, 2014, si recuerdo bien, de radio y cosas así también.
Okay, well, let's proceed on this particular subject, shall we?
Vale, vamos a seguir entonces para este tema que nos ocupa.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, I've got obviously a lot of questions. This interview could take infinity.
So what's the subject?
The subject is God's attributes and qualities.
Mm-hmm.
So just to start off with, I feel like we should cover evidence that there is actually a God.
Right.
So when I met you, I was an atheist.
Right.
And, you know,
So you were an atheist scientist.
I was an atheist scientist, you know, traditional atheist scientist.
Do you mind me asking you why you were an atheist? Had you given it much thought, or you?
I just put all my faith in science, really, and evolution.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Gotcha.
I felt that there was other things.
Unknown things.
Yeah, but I thought that science would explain a lot.
Que explicaría mucho, sí, muchas cosas, que las explicaría en algún momento.
Right, and science would be able to explain those other things from a purely physical investigation of science, is it? Is that what you felt?
Eventually, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. So then what happened was I met you, and then I started implementing your teachings to get in touch with my feelings, long for divine love.
May I ask you what caused you to do that? Like, it's a pretty unusual thing for somebody to do right at the beginning.
Well, I did have a history of doing yoga, so
Right.
I had experienced chi flow and things like that.
Right.
So I was interested in that kind of thing. And
Is it also because you're a scientist and you love experimenting? Is that part of it as well?
and you said you could explain the secrets of the universe, and I said yes, thank you.
No worries.
Listen for that.
No worries.
Yeah, so that was got me interested.
Yeah.
And I was just obviously intrigued because you said you were Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, the way you explained to find out where there was a God was to connect your feelings along with divine love.
Yeah.
And I did that.
Yeah.
And then I started receiving divine love.
Right.
And then that convinced me over time that there is a God that exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is it possible to prove that there is a God through experimentation that's not just like through a subjective experience?
Definitely, of course, that would be the case. You would think, wouldn't you? And so yes, there are ways to experiment with God's existence scientifically, rather than actually doing it on a personal level. The difference between the two is that if you do it on a personal level, you enter this personal relationship with God, which you've started to discover. Whereas if you do it on a purely scientific level, you could find out that a God exists, but still not have a personal relationship with that being. So while the experimental process can be valid, a valid way of discovering the truth of God's existence, it's not a very valid way of demonstrating or developing a relationship with that God. And so there are many scientists who have passed over into the spirit world in particular who do believe now that there is a God, but they still do not have a personal relationship with that God. In fact, they sort of have a viewpoint that God is so large, potentially, that they feel it's probably impossible to have a personal relationship with that God, is what their personal feelings are about the matter. So when you speak with different spirits when you're in the spirit world who come from Earth with a scientific background, you often find that they do believe there is a God, particularly by the time they've reached the sixth dimension. Many of them do believe there is a God, but they find it very difficult to accept that you can have a personal relationship with that God. The beauty of experimenting with the personal relationship is you discover that a personal relationship is possible very early in the piece.
Bueno, aquí pongo una aclaración porque no sabía cómo traducirlo de peace, pues debe ser una frase hecha que tienen muy corrientita, que no hace falta, a lo mejor no había hecho falta poner tanta parrafada aquí por mi parte, ni mucho menos, pero bueno, eso tampoco busqué muchísimo cómo traducir eso. Entonces, es muy pronto, bueno, en la vida podemos decir que es posible hacer esto de descubrir una relación personal con Dios muy pronto. Suponemos que comparando la vida con la obra, pero no creo que lo diga en plan poético, sino que debe ser una frase hecha. Y seguimos.
But also you gain a lot of extra knowledge and your viewpoint widens very rapidly. With regard to the types of experiments you could actually undertake, as you've discovered yourself. So now, with what you're doing, I think, with the soul-based team, the Soul God's Way of Love team, is experimenting with different scientific principles with regard to emotions, which is something that not very many scientists do until they're well into the spirit world, into the upper dimensions of the spirit world.
Okay, so is it your intention to try and prove while on earth that God does exist?
Well, there's two parts, I suppose you could say, to the intention of returning to earth. One part is, yes, to prove that God does exist, but while proving God does exist has a benefit to mankind, it doesn't actually have much personal benefit to the individual. So there is the second part, which is proving that a personal relationship with God actually can be developed. And also causes major changes within the individual themselves and the way they develop and their capacity to, and their personal power, their power to do different things.
Poder personal, añade ahí, que no estaría en las transcripciones para hacer cosas.
And so it's very important to understand that even though we may believe there is a God, it doesn't necessarily mean that that belief will translate into a relationship with God. And so this is why I feel it's very important for most people to understand that we can develop methods to discover scientifically whether God exists or not, and even to discover whether spirit world exists or the other dimensional space that I've referred to exist. We can design experiments to prove the existence of those dimensional spaces scientifically. However, even if we provide that evidence and proof, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person will have a personal experience with God and actually engage this process of personal growth through the process. And what I'm trying to do is encourage both of those things, not just one. So in terms of answering your question about scientific experiments that you could perform to examine whether God exists or not, many of those experiments involve things that mankind are currently limited in terms of the way they experiment. So, for example, some of them involve the discovery of new particles that we will need to discover through some scientific experiments that are based around physics. Other experiments will be based around the emotions and how experimenting with, and this has already begun on Earth, but experimenting with the transmission of information via emotions between, for example, or a mother and a child, and between people in different locations on Earth, and to see what kind of instantaneous effect that has. And in those kind of experiments, you'll discover that we can transmit thoughts and feelings faster than the speed of light. And so therefore we discover that the speed of light is not the limiting factor in terms of communication and transportation. And through a number of other different experiments, we can find that there has to be a creator of these particular things through a number of different experiments that we could undertake. Rather than going into those experiments at this point, I feel those experiments are very complicated in comparison to the experiment that you undertook via suggestion right at the beginning of the process of meeting me. And that experiment is very simple and very easy to undertake, doesn't require much setup, and it doesn't require any measuring instruments or anything like that other than your own feelings and emotions and sensations in your own physical form. And also the ability, as you have known and worked on yourself, there is an effect on your brain and on your body that can be measured. So if we had the appropriate apparatus, we could actually measure those effects initially and therefore prove quite rapidly that a personal relationship with God is available and therefore God must also exist.
Okay. Right. So we'll just assume that God does exist for the rest of the purpose of this conversation.
Yes, I suppose you need to. The question of God's existence is a completely different subject.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's a subject that is worthy of attention and worthy of discussion. And I feel at some point in the future we'll provide some information about experiments that can be undertaken to prove the existence of the spirit world, multidimensional spaces, God's existence, and people in other forms existing, as well as answering a lot of other questions that I've been putting forward as statements about divine truth. Yeah.
Okay. So, is it possible that there's not just one God, and that God is like a child of another God?
Well, that is possible, but answering the question is very, very difficult. And the best thing I can say about those kind of questions that they are yet to be resolved, and as a result of them yet to be resolved, there is the possibility of the potential of it existing. And it's like most questions. There are groups of questions that we can resolve quite rapidly, and then there are other groups of questions that are very, very difficult to resolve because of their nature. The questions surrounding God and how God came into existence are very, very difficult to resolve, because we have no strong way of being able to measure how God came into existence. And the main reason why is it's like the creation trying to understand the creator. So imagine.
Y la principal razón de por qué es eso, de que no tengamos una forma poderosa, potente de hacerlo, añade ahí, la principal razón es porque eso, es como si la creación tratara de entender al creador. Le faltaba esa frase a la transcripción, como vemos, donde él hace esa unión de estos dos puntos, digamos, un punto y seguido. No tenemos esa forma poderosa, potente de poder medir cómo llegó Dios a la existencia, claro, porque imagina, es como si la creación tratara de entender al creador, ¿no?
Imagine for a moment you made a car and you built the car, and then you asked the car to understand you. Now, it'd be very, very difficult for the car to understand you without having your intelligence, your feelings, your emotions, your capacity to absorb information. And obviously anything you create probably will not have the same capacity as yourself. And for that reason, the thing you create will find it very, very difficult to understand you completely. Even if it has intelligence, and even if you've given it intelligence, the way, a method of examining through experimentation or through personal relationship, either method, it's still going to be quite difficult to understand some parts of the person who created you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is probably another one of those questions, but I'm going to ask anyway.
Yeah.
God created the universe, and the universe is 13.7 billion years old or something like that.
Close to 14 billion, shall we say, as a round figure, years old, the physical universe that we exist in currently. So do not assume that that is the only universe that has ever been created. There could be potentially universes side by side physically in space from each other. So that is a potential as well. So we can't say that the only universe that was ever created is 14 billion years old. We can only say that due to different scientific measurements that we can currently make, we can make some assumptions based on different theories. And then base the age of the current physical universe as around about 14 billion years old.
Okay, so how old does that make God?
Well, obviously God has to be older than that.
Yes.
For God to have created the universe itself, then God has to be older than the universe itself. Also, it also makes sense if you look at it, that if God created the physical universe and the other dimensional spaces, then God has to exist outside of those dimensional spaces and outside of that universe. It doesn't mean that God can't get into the universe somehow, because there's a possibility of that occurring, just like you can create a car and then you can jump inside of it and use it. And there is also the possibility that God could do a very similar thing. Create a universe and then jump inside the universe and utilize it in some way. However, the existence of the universe being that it existed after God, therefore we would have to assume from that God has to be older than that universe. And also greater in power than the universe that was created. And also utilising something, other forms of energy which we have yet to discover, to create that universe as well. So there's quite a number of things we can assume once we start understanding that God is an entity, and we also understand that God existed before the universe created.
Okay, so you don't know how old God is?
No idea how old God is at all. And at this stage, my presumption is that God is possibly infinite in time, and I don't understand yet emotionally or intellectually how that could be the case. But there is no other possible presumption if you think about it, because it's a bit like if God as an entity does exist, then it explains the universe's spontaneity in terms of coming into existence. But how did God come into existence? It would not make sense that intelligence came from no source. And obviously, if you look at the intelligence in the universe and all of the laws involved in the universe that we currently have, the physical laws, as well as the other laws that mankind has yet to discover, all tend to indicate highly intelligent being in terms of creation of the universe. And if that is the case, then where did that intelligence come from if it spontaneously came into existence? It doesn't make much sense. So We don't really know those particular things about God. All we can do is examine God's creation, and through this personal relationship with God, discover quite a lot of God's attributes and qualities that way. But my assumptions at this point in time are that God has infinitely existed and that God has an infinite number of qualities to actually discover. That being the case, I will spend the rest of my existence discovering them, and but I will also, during that period, find a lot of answers about the universe itself, that I live, myself, you and other people, how we all exist, how we all function. And there is the large potential of myself growing to such a condition that we know, and each person who's ever existed coming to such a condition that we know large amounts about the universe. And large amounts about ourselves, and large amounts about each other, but still know, in comparison, quite a small amount about God.
Okay, so you said that God is located outside the universe, in one particular place, or like all around?
Well, since it's impossible for me to get outside of the universe myself, and impossible for any being God has created, in fact, at this point in time, to exist outside of the universe, it's impossible also to answer that question as to where God's presence is outside of the universe in terms of its localized place. It is possible, though, to answer the question as to how that presence is felt and how that presence is observed throughout the universe. And so it's possible to discover those kind of questions and answer those kind of questions, but I do not believe it is possible at this point to answer the question of where is God's localized existence, assuming God is an entity of some form. Where is God's localized existence outside of the universe? We can only assume through our logical reasoning that God must exist outside the universe if the universe was created after God existed.
So, you said it's possible for God to come into the universe.
Yes.
Has God ever come into the universe that you know of?
God comes in the universe constantly.
Parts of God or all of God?
Parts of God come into the universe constantly. I'm pretty sure that if God entered the universe fully, we would all be pretty... Oh, not so much squashed, because it depends on the condition that we're in and whether we're at one with God or not, as to whether we could absorb that energetically. So my feelings are that God at this point has not ever fully entered the universe, but in fact, God's love, one of God's major attributes, has never fully entered the universe at this point either. And again, if we assume that God is infinite in nature and therefore God's qualities must be infinite in nature, we can see that it would be impossible for God's infinite love to enter the universe without it being a gradualized process where it gradually increases in its intensity to a certain point. For God's love to enter the universe all at once would be a physical impossibility as well.
Right. So, God is obviously massively large. You assume.
We assume.
You assume.
When we say massively large, it'd probably be better to use the term. But remember that God is obviously made up of different dimensional matter than we are made up of. Obviously, it's the same with regard to us when we create some kind of object ourselves. Like, you know, any object that we have around us that we create ourselves, it is created in a little different way. For instance, the whiteboard or the recording material, your own paper, all of those kind of things, they are physical matters. They are all still atomic structures, you know, with very, very rapidly rotating energy particles. But the matter that's in your body is very different because it has the ability to live. There's a breath of life that exists in it, whereas the breath of life in the paper, for example, has disappeared. And so anything that man creates at this point in time, none of it really seems to have the breath of life in it. Whereas all the things that God has created all seem to have a breath of life in them. When you look at the majority of them, there's the inanimate stuff that does not seem to have that breath of life, but there's the animate stuff that all seems to have a breath of life, going from very, very small single-cell organisms right the way up through the food chain, I suppose you could call it, to man himself or woman herself. We have all got this living structure, this living material that seems, and life seems to be able to exit those materials and enter those materials somehow, and man still really hasn't discovered how that occurs. But to me, that proves a lot about how God uses material. There's obviously material that is inanimate in its nature. It still degrades and it shifts in its form, but there is more animate material in its nature as well that seems to be animated through some kind of pulling together from some kind of structure into a living form. And these living forms, we can assume God's form must be greater than all of these living forms placed together. And that God herself must also have a living form of some kind. But it has to exist outside of the dimensional spaces that currently exist. So therefore, it must be of a different type of nature of living form. Than we are currently able to conceive.
Okay, so you don't know what God is made of or what God looks like?
No, I'm struggling still, and to even after 2,000 years of existence, and also a lot of information in the spirit world, I'm struggling still to understand the different particles that exist in the universe, and there are the potential of even more particles yet to be discovered in the universe. Without discovering the particles that exist outside of the universe, of which God must be made up of. So that's a whole different, another scientific experiment, set of experiments that are way beyond my current emotional and intellectual capacity to understand and grasp.
Okay, so I think it's ready to move on to questions that you can answer.
No worries. No worries.
I had to ask those.
It's very important to ask those questions because we can spend a lot of time postulating and theorising about things like that, when the reality is I feel there are many more important questions to ask. And the reality too is that if we spend a lot of time theorizing about things that obviously logically are going to be very, very difficult to ask, then it seems to be a fair bit of a waste of our time. And actually, we need to get firstly onto the questions we can answer, and then use those questions that we can answer as a platform to discover the questions that we cannot answer.
Yeah. Okay. So God is love. So is love a substance of God? That's actually part of God?
Yes, it's a substance of God. So divine love, what I'm calling divine love, is a substance that exists within God. It's separate to the universe itself. It does not exist in the universe itself without it being transmitted from God to a soul in the universe. So it can exist in the universe only through transmission from God. Whereas the natural love, which is a different form of love, a different substance again, can be transmitted between yourself and myself, and we do not need to involve God in the transmission of that particular substance. And in fact, every single emotion that we actually have is a substance of some kind. And it therefore makes sense that one of the emotions that transforms our soul, which is God's love, must be also a substance. Yes.
So when we receive divine love, we're actually receiving a part of God into us.
Yes.
And that's part of the reason why our soul expands.
Exactly. It's a particle. It's obviously a particle that exists from a physics perspective. A particle that enters us, that has the ability, the way God's designed our soul, has the ability to transform it, has the ability to make it transform into a new creature. It's very different from all other substances that can enter our soul. Because all other substances that come from within our universe that enter our soul, and there are many of those, many of those cannot transform us into anything beyond what our original nature was created to be. So it's a very, very different type of substance. And in fact, my, again, assumption is that God may have other types of substances besides God's love that could potentially enter us as well and transform us in a different direction. And but I've yet to fully discover those substances. I have some assumptions that I've made about some of those substances. And I'm experimenting with the ability to absorb them, but as yet I have not personally discovered the other substances that could have the same transforming effect.
So what do you think they are?
Well, one that comes to mind immediately is wisdom. as a substance from God. In that if you examine the universe very, very carefully, you can see that it is very, very complex in its nature, and it's full of highly developed intelligence. And even if we look at our Earth, we can see the intelligence required to design something like a body of any kind, like a physical form of any kind, such as an animal, a dog, a cat, or so forth, or a human body. Huge amounts of intelligence involved in creating such a form. And that being the case, there must be huge amounts of intelligence available inside of God. Now, as you receive divine love, your capacity to absorb intellectual things or absorb knowledge grows. And so we have the capacity to understand things intellectually. But the wisdom of how to use them together and to create a framework in which they all operate together without self-destruction, without anarchy, this is an entirely different set of things that constrain the physical universe. And so from my perspective, I see discovery in two different areas really that are important. Firstly, there's the discovery of what the creations are themselves. And I'm always fascinated in anything discovering in that direction. But there's also the discovery of the laws that constrain or control the creation, or constrain the universe in which we exist. And those laws seem to have a different nature altogether. They're like a framework that exists without a physical form, but they must have some kind of form, some kind of energetic structure to exist. Very much like a law of gravity, for example, is created through mass creating gravity, and we have some kind of structure that creates gravity. And so we know that if we have a small mass, then there's a small amount of gravity. If we have a large mass, then there's a larger amount of gravity. And these other laws must also exist in a similar forms that we can at some point measure. But you know, there are just so many of those laws, an infinite number, it appears, of those laws even, that to me that's another area of fascinating examination. So examination of the laws is even more interesting than the examination of the creation that the laws create. And I sort of see it as the creation. Then there's the laws that constrain the creation, which, if you think of it like layers of an onion, there's the internal layer, which is the creation itself. Then there's the outside layer, which is the laws or the structure that actually control that creation. And we've discovered many of those laws, many of them pertain to love, and we've discovered in the universe many of those laws, but I still feel there's many more of those laws to discover. And the more of those laws we discover, we may find that there is another layer that controls the law somehow, before we even get to the layer that allows us to understand God completely. So, you know, these are all just assumptions that we can make based on what's already been discovered and using that as a foundation to go ahead with further discovery.
So is God's laws, is it what's the law made of? Is it an intention of God?
Well, yes, I feel quite strongly that, again, it must be made up of a substance of some kind of energy or substance. It has to have existed before the universe came into existence. So therefore, it has to be made up of a similar type of substance that God is made up of, if you think about it in some way, or a substance closer to the substance that God is made up of. And this is why my real fascination is more with the laws than it is with the physical, the physical examination of creation. The physical examination of creation is obviously made up of a completely different substance to what God's made up of, because it existed after God existed, so therefore was created by God. But before those physical substances came into existence, the laws had to have come into existence. So therefore, they have to be made up of a different type of substance that the universe that is even present within the universe. Although the laws have to be present upon the universe to operate and force the universe to conform to God's intentions or desires. So for that reason, we could then presume that the laws have to be closer to God's nature than the physical creation is. And so that's why my areas of investigation, right from shortly after I discovered the whole process of receiving divine love, has been focused more upon the laws and God's nature in terms of the feelings that I could feel from God, than on the physical investigation of life itself and matter on earth or matter in the physical world. Yeah.
So do you think divine truth isn't a substance of God?
You could say divine truth is more like it's the best way to describe it would be, divine truth is more like a constraining force upon the substances. Something is either true or not true. There is no in between with God. So there's no quite often when I was growing up, I had different persons say to me that they felt that there was white and black when it came to answers, and then when there was hundreds of levels of shades of grey, and they likened it often to the human eye can see, 1,024, or I forget the total amount of shades of grey that we're capable of measuring with the human eye, and they basically likened morality and other issues and also all questions as shades of grey with white and black on either end. And my feelings are with God, though, there is just white or black in the sense of answers. There is a truthful answer or a non-truthful answer. While we're discovering the truth, there will be shades of grey. So one of the discussions I would love to have, and we'll do an interview of shortly, will be about the qualities of truth. Because it's very important to answer the questions about the qualities of truth before you can really answer other questions. Even questions about God can't really be answered without understanding the qualities of truth. So we need to discuss that as a probably different topic at some point. The qualities of truth. But if you examine truth either is or is not. There is only two potential options of something being true or not true. We can slowly discover more of it but eventually we will arrive on any particular subject that it is or it is not. One of those two things. Now, that there doesn't have to be a substance for that truth to exist. Do you understand? And so for that reason, I feel personally that truth is not a substance as love or other emotions are a substance. However, truth is emotional in the sense that without understanding love and other emotions, we will never come to an understanding of truth.
So when the truth enters our soul, that's an emotional experience. That's not a substance of God entering us.
No, I don't feel it's often as the truth enters us, the substance of God's love also enters us at the same time. So it's very, very hard to separate the two. Does that make sense? From each other. So while we're receiving divine love, at the same time, we're automatically having these amazing realizations of truths that we didn't understand before. And so we can't really divorce the two from the truth, divine truth and divine love from each other. But I am sure that divine truth is able to exist and be discovered without love yet being felt. So, for example, this is very much like a scientist going through an experiment, not feeling anything about the actual end result of the experiment, but discovering that there is such a thing as gravity, as a truth. You know, and then later on, after further experiments, discovering there is this another divine truth, which is the truth of aerodynamics. That in an atmosphere we have the possibility of creating a certain shape and therefore creating lift and therefore lifting above the ground if we have enough power. And this is another truth, but the scientists who discover it doesn't, you know, he might go through many emotional experiences doing that. That'll be based on his desire and passions and so forth. But the truth itself about the law of gravity or the law of aerodynamics hasn't entered him as an emotion. It's just entered him as a belief, a trust that he has that particular thing that he can rely upon. So I feel that while truths will enter us after we have processed certain emotions, there is a possibility to discover certain truths without having gone through an emotional experience.
Bueno, ¿qué tal estamos? Se tuvo que salir Ana. Ya nos dijo que estaba allí con líos en la casa y cosas. Y bueno, lo vamos a dejar por aquí para no hacerlo súper largo. Y ya lo seguiré en otros puntos. A ver qué tal ha ido esta vez. Que hacía tiempo que no hacíamos esto y tampoco en directo para hacer así en este formato también cómodo a veces de poner el vídeo y los subtítulos. Pues aquí lo dejaré. Llevamos solo menos de 40 minutos, pero bueno, para no hacerlo muy largo, como he dicho. Vale, pues gracias y hasta el siguiente.